So today I want to work on showing a lunge and split squat progression. So same basic components. Anytime I want to make exercise more difficult, I can either make my base of support narrower, adding a balance component, or add a more unstable surface. Again, it's the balance component. So the balance components really require more stability and more engagement of multiple muscles. So whereas a traditional squat, a traditional lunge is going to work mainly throughout our quadricep muscles, maybe a little bit of glutes depending on how we're doing them, how low we're going. You might get some calf muscle when you're up on your toes on your back leg, but you're not necessarily going to get as much full body engagement. Once I add the balance component in, I get a little bit more core muscle because I have to use my core muscles to stabilize myself and keep me from wobbling. Depending on what kind of surface I have, I might have to engage my ankle muscles to keep from having the medial and lateral movement or the anterior posterior movement. So again, that little bit of extra difficulty makes a difference in how many muscles I'm engaging. So my traditional squat, all I want to do is step forward. I want to be able to have my feet far enough apart that I'm going to be about 90-90 for both knees. So coming all the way to the ground. When I feel like that knee went a little bit further forward than I wanted it to, it's still not stressing the joint because it didn't go above my toes, but I can make it a little bit further. So now I've got straight down from my hip, 90 degrees at the back knee, 90 degrees at the front knee. You have a choice between doing all 5, 10, however many repetitions you're doing on one leg and then switching, or you can switch in between. If you're going to switch in between, you can make it a little bit more difficult by adding kind of a plyometric component. So jump and split. Don't do those very often. I don't like plyometrics. So anyway, that's one way that you can make life a little bit harder for yourself. You're going to get your heart rate going quite a bit more. Entirely optional. If you just purely want the strengthening, then just do one leg before you switch to the other. So as far as making my lunges a little bit more difficult, again, I'm going to bring in my balance component. So I can start with something simple like the foam pad or a pillow or a couple of pillows. I have a choice between putting it in my front leg or my back leg. So if I choose to put it under my back leg, I'm going to naturally shift more weight onto my front leg because it's a little bit more difficult. There's also a component to having that back leg in the up on your toes position. It really isn't conducive to a lot of weight bearing. So typically when we're doing a lunge, our working leg is mainly going to be the front leg. That's one that most of the quad is working. The back leg, you're going to get a little bit of strength in, but not as much. Now, once I put it on my front leg, again, I'm shifting more of my weight onto my back leg. Still have the majority on my front leg, but it does require me to get a little bit more engagement back here. And I'm getting a little bit more in my quads, a little bit of my glutes, and a little bit of the calf, but not that much. Okay? So again, you can kind of play with it, figure out where you prefer it to be, and where you feel more stable. The important part before you advance anything is that you do one well before you advance to the next step. Next, I'm gonna go to my little balance disc. So this is the one that I got for maybe 20 bucks on Amazon. This one I can either step back and do more of a dynamic movement. This is called a retro lunge. So when I'm stepping forward, balance, step back, lunge. With this, I want to try and pause and catch my balance at each step before I do the backward movement. When I'm stepping backwards, I want to try and maintain that position, maintain that balance, maintain the control, and do it slowly. It's fairly easy for me to go like this, but I'm not getting as much in that control and isolation of the stabilization, which I want. So personally, I would rather go slow and controlled, really isolate the movement, really get a good stability rather than going quickly. Because quickly, you can kind of use momentum and just kind of throw yourself around, versus when you go slow, you really have to work every single muscle to slow the movement down and maintain your balance during it. So personally, especially with the retro lunge, I prefer to do it in a slow, controlled movement. If I'm not doing the stepping off, if I don't feel like stepping each time, what I can do instead is I can put it, again, front leg or back leg, my foot stays there versus doing the stepping forward and back. And now it's just using it as that dynamic surface to give me a little bit extra control and a few extra muscles to be engaged. Same with going forward. I put my foot in the middle of the ring, find my balance, maintain it, and go down and just stay there and try and maintain the ankle control, not necessarily doing a dynamic movement. One thing to note, I've got this on carpet. It slides a little bit, so if you are using something like this, you might want to put it on like a yoga mat or something that'll grip it a little bit better. So the last thing for my lunges before we go into split squats, it's going to be my good old trusty Bosu. For me personally, same idea as the disc. I can do stationary lunge. And this one, because of the height of the Bosu, shifts a heck of a lot more weight onto my back leg. In this position, I'm getting a little bit of my hip flexors as well as my quads. The other component, just like with the disc, I can do a nice, slow, controlled retro lunge. Come down, come back up, and get my balance. On the squat, I personally find it more difficult to balance on the flat surface. For the lunge, it's the opposite for me. I find it more difficult, especially if I'm doing a retro lunge. I find it more difficult to balance on the ball surface because I have a lot more ankle movement that I have to try and control, which I'm failing, so don't mind me. So ideally I want a little bit more control. So for this one, like I said, how you want to make sure you have control in one before you go to the next. So I can balance on the other side of the Bosu. This side of the Bosu is harder for me to balance on. It's harder for me to get that. So before I start doing a retro lunge on this particular surface of the Bosu, I might want to work on just balancing on one leg and try and get that ankle slightly more controlled so that I can get my posterior movement without losing my balance. So it's just something to think about. And again, I can do it stationary. I can just keep my foot there. I can have it as my back foot or my front foot, depending on which surface I want. Okay? So those are our lunges. Split squat is a slightly different exercise. With a split squat, the way we do it is one leg is elevated up and behind us. So that elevated leg is not working leg. You may, depending on what surface you're using, get some weight through it. You might be using it slightly, but the main leg is going to be your front leg. I'm going to show how to do it with a very stable surface. In this case, I'm using my inversion stool. A somewhat dynamic surface in the yoga swing, and a very dynamic surface with my physio ball. So I'm going to make a separate video for the split squat purely because I got to get the swing back up.